Welcome back to America's Now. The U.S. government has set up an emergency shelter in Texas because of a surge of young illegal migrants traveling alone into the country. The shelter, located at an Air Force base in San Antonio, holds as many as 1,000 children who are crossing every week. The youngsters are mostly coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And they're making the perilous journey north through Mexico without parents or close adult relatives. For a closer look at this issue, Laura Carlson joins us with more. Laura, why is this issue getting so much attention lately, and what is driving it?
We've been seeing a surge in unaccompanied minors going through Mexico up to the U.S.-Mexico border since about late fall last year. And what happened in this case that it became such a big issue is the United Nations issued a very important report where they actually interviewed about 400 of the migrants as to the reasons that they were coming and what conditions they were facing. And then the U.S. press, of course, caught on to that, and we've been seeing story after story about the issue. Now, what's driving it in terms of why we're seeing this surge for the last couple of months is a much more complicated issue. And there we've seen a lot of different explanations. One of the ones that's unfortunately coming out in the press is that parents are sending their children because they've heard that migration policies in the United States are softer, that in effect they'll be granting amnesty to children. This is not true in the sense that they have not changed at all, and there is no automatic amnesty for children. And it's also not true that that's the reason. In all the interviews that we've done in Mexico within the shelters, which is a place where you can get a good sense of what's happening with migration flows, we very rarely hear anything like an expectation that there'll be a change in migration policy in the United States. And the sad reality of it is that these people are coming because they have no other options. When you consider the risks that they're facing, it's the clearest indication that the conditions that they're facing in their home countries are absolutely impossible at that point. And for parents to take on the risk of sending children up with human smugglers is also an indication that they're getting reports from back home that their children can no longer stay.
We'll talk about some of those issues because it seems like a lot of those parents, as you said, feel like they have no choice.
Yeah, they're between a rock and a hard place. They know what their children are going to go through on that journey, and it runs from everything from rape of girls and women, which is very common along the road in Mexico, to extortion, bribery, forced recruitment into gangs, to smuggled drugs. There's all kinds of perils that they face when they come up. But what's happening, we're seeing the surge basically in 3 countries: Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And Honduras is by far the largest. And what's happening there is we're seeing a huge increase in the number of people who report violence as the reason. It used to be that poverty and the inability to feed the children was one of the big things that's happening. But now what we're seeing is that the mothers are saying, I'm left alone, because these are families that have already been following a migratory trail to the United States. So what you're seeing is the latest link in what's kind of a chain of desperation, as the people that work in the shelters call it. Because first the fathers left because they couldn't make a living, and then the older children, first the men, then the women, and now the mothers are left with the younger children, and they're still struggling to make a living, and they're also finding that the risk that those younger children, especially the boys, will be forcibly recruited or wounded by gang violence in their cities is so high that they can't take it anymore. So that's one of the biggest things that's happening within these countries. Honduras now has a huge homicide rate, the largest in the world.
Well, you are here testifying before U.S. lawmakers at a congressional hearing about this issue. What do you think needs to happen to change the mindset of lawmakers here in the United States?
This is very important because the reaction so far from Washington has been to throw more money at detention facilities, some kind of infrastructure for these kids, which they need, some money at legal representation, but they are not facing the issue that U.S. policies have really caused a lot of this surge in migrants. First of all, because the free trade agreement with Central America, the same has happened with Mexico, is spurring migration, especially from the countryside, because they have to compete with these products, agricultural products from the United States, and they can't do it. We know in Mexico that migration surged after the free trade agreement to 500,000 a year, and now we're seeing the same kind of thing happening in the Central American countries. And then the other part of it is that since they've had this militarized approach to fighting organized crime in Mexico and also in Central America, what it's done is it's given a lot of money to corrupt police and armed forces, and violence and public safety in general, instead of going down as a result of that security policy, has gone way up. You can see it correlates perfectly with this militarized approach to public safety that's happening in these countries. So unless legislators face these policy decisions with a lot of self-criticism and say, what role have we had in causing this surge, they're not going to be able to resolve it.
All right, Laura Carlson, thank you so much for your insight and for an update. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up.
Fighting crime while teaching boxing in New York.
We got a couple of guys here that were basically very heavy into drugs, into alcohol, and we turned their lives around. They got married, they got children.
America's Next.